I never thought at 54 years old, with a college degree and 3 decades of corporate experience, I'd be checking my watch at 9 p.m. because my 79-year-old mother still locks the front deadbolt at 10 sharp. Those are the exact words of David Carter, a man who, on paper, represents the pinnacle of the traditional American dream. If you saw his resume, you would see a seasoned logistics manager who spent the last 15 years pulling in a comfortable $120,000 a year in downtown Atlanta. If you looked at his bank account just 12 months ago, you would have seen nearly $300,000 in liquid savings and equity. Yet, tonight, David isn't relaxing in a master suite of a suburban 5-bedroom home, nor is he enjoying a high-rise condo overlooking the city skyline. Instead, he is staring up at a popcorn ceiling, lying uncomfortably on a twin-sized mattress with a faded blue superhero sheets pattern, the exact same room he vacated in the summer of 1990. To the outside world, this looks like a catastrophic failure, the ultimate nightmare of a middle-aged man who somehow lost it all and had to crawl back to his childhood home with his tail between his legs. In American culture, the unwritten rule has always been ironclad. You pack your bags at 18, you conquer the world, and you never, ever move back unless you hit absolute rock bottom. If you are in your 20s, moving back home is a temporary setback. If you are in your 30s, it is an embarrassment. But if you are over 50, it is treated like a total economic obituary. But David didn't lose his mind. He didn't gamble away his fortune, and he isn't lazy. In fact, what is happening to David tonight is not an isolated incident of personal failure, but rather the opening chapter of a massive, quiet crisis that is currently reshaping the entire fabric of the American middle class. Across the United States, from the costly suburbs of California to the sprawling metro areas of Texas and the East Coast, a silent epidemic is forcing millions of established, hard-working 50-something professionals to sell their properties, pack up their lives, and move back into their elderly parents' homes. They aren't doing it because they want to, and they aren't doing it because they are broke in the traditional sense. They are doing it because the economic reality of 2026 has created a bizarre illusion where earning a 6-figure salary and having hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank is no longer enough to maintain a basic independent life. This is the story of the 50-plus boomerang generation, a demographic that did everything right, followed every single rule of the American system, yet still found themselves standing on their parents' porches with a trunk full of clothes, wondering how on earth they ended up right back where they started. To truly understand how someone like David Carter ended up back in his childhood bedroom, you have to look at the invisible financial monster that has been quietly dismantling the American middle class over the past few years. For decades, the math of American life was simple and predictable because if you earned a 6-figure salary, you were guaranteed a comfortable life anywhere in the country. But by the time 2026 rolled around, that math completely broke down due to a phenomenon economists call lifestyle creep mixed with hyperinflation. After his divorce 3 years ago, David did what any successful professional would do by renting a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood close to his corporate office. At first, the $3,000 a month rent seemed manageable for a man making $10,000 every single month before taxes. But then the hidden costs of modern American survival began to chip away at his foundation like termites in a wooden beam. His health insurance premiums jumped 15% in a single year, his auto insurance skyrocketed because of new corporate algorithms, and a basic trip to the grocery store for one person started costing $250 a week. Every single month, David watched his hard-earned money vanish into a black hole of administrative fees, utility spikes, and subscriptions that he could not escape. He was running as fast as he could on a financial treadmill that kept speeding up, yet he was actually moving backward. The $300,000 he had saved wasn't growing because high interest rates made borrowing money for a new home completely impossible, with mortgage rates hovering at a level that would double his monthly payments compared to 5 years ago. He realized that if he wanted to buy a standard $200,000 townhouse, he would end up paying over $4,000 a month just to the bank, which would leave him with absolutely nothing for retirement. It became a terrifying psychological trap where you feel rich on paper because of your corporate title, but you feel completely impoverished every time you open your banking application on your phone. David looked at his projected retirement age of 65 and realized that at this current rate, he would be working until the day he died just to pay a landlord or a banking conglomerate. He was spending nearly $40,000 a year just on rent, money that was completely evaporating into nothingness without building any equity or future security for his golden years. The tipping point came when his landlord announced another 12% rent increase for the upcoming lease agreement, a move that would push his housing costs past $3,500 a month. That was the exact moment David realized that the traditional path of maintaining a separate, independent household just to keep up appearances was no longer a sign of success, but rather a form of financial suicide. The American dream had transformed into a giant financial illusion, an expensive theater production where the actors were going broke just to buy their own tickets. He sat down with a calculator and realized that by swallowing his pride and moving back into his mother's house, he could instantly redirect almost $4,000 a month back into his own pocket. It was a brutal realization that the only way to save his future was to completely abandon the present that society told him he was supposed to live. But the most shocking thing David discovered during this agonizing transition was that he was absolutely not alone in his desperation. One late Tuesday night, while packing his kitchen dishes into cardboard boxes, he stumbled upon an invite-only digital community that completely shattered his isolation. It was a private online forum populated exclusively by American professionals over the age of 50 who were all planning, or had already executed, the exact same retreat back to their childhood homes. For the first time in months, David realized that his secret shame was actually a massive, underground movement cutting across the entire nation. In that digital space, high-earning architects from Chicago, former tech executives from Silicon Valley, and veteran nurses from Boston were all exchanging advice on how to navigate this deeply unsettling reality. The discussions in this group were not about teenage angst or youthful rebellion, but rather about the tactical and psychological strategies required to survive as a 50-year-old child. They shared detailed strategies on how to carefully pack a U-Haul truck in the dead of night, so that nosy suburban neighbors would assume they were just storing furniture rather than moving back in with their elderly parents. They talked about how to handle the profound embarrassment of running into old high school acquaintances at the local grocery store, and how to deflect the inevitable questions about why they were living on the south side of town again after 30 years of absence. David spent hours scrolling through hundreds of posts, reading stories that sounded exactly like his own reflection in a mirror. He learned that across America, the stigma of the boomerang child was undergoing a massive demographic shift. While the media constantly focused on 20-something college graduates moving back to their parents' basements, the true financial bleeding was happening to the 50-somethings who were losing their grip on middle-class stability just before the retirement finish line. This hidden community became David's psychological lifeline, a place where he did not have to pretend that everything was perfect or wear the exhausting mask of corporate success. The members of the group even created their own vocabulary, referring to their situation as tactical relocation rather than financial defeat. They looked at the hard data and realized that by pooling generational resources, they were actually protecting their inheritance from being swallowed up by corporate landlords and skyrocketing medical costs. It was a collective realization that the old American expectation of every single family unit maintaining an isolated, expensive piece of real estate was an unsustainable relic of the past. By the time David finally closed his laptop that night, the crushing weight of his personal failure had transformed into a strange sense of shared purpose. He was no longer just a divorced, middle-aged man who could not afford his rent. He was a soldier in a massive, silent army of millions of Americans who were rewriting the rules of survival in an economy that had abandoned them. He realized that his next big challenge would not be dealing with the opinions of his peers or the judgment of his neighbors, but rather facing the one person who still held all the power over his daily existence. His 79-year-old mother, Sarah Carter, who was waiting for him at the end of that long driveway in the suburbs. The true test of David Carter's radical decision began on a humid Saturday afternoon when his rented moving truck pulled up to the curb of the modest split-level house on Oak Street. Waiting for him on the front porch was his 79-year-old mother, Sarah Carter, holding a legal pad and a pen instead of a batch of fresh cookies. Sarah was a sharp, independent woman who had managed that household alone since David's father passed away 12 years ago, and she was not about to let her 54-year-old son disrupt her carefully ordered universe without a clear set of rules. Before David could even carry his first cardboard box of corporate awards through the front door, Sarah called an official family meeting at the kitchen table. What followed was not a warm, emotional homecoming, but rather the negotiation of a highly detailed, legally minded roommate agreement. Sarah made it clear that while she loved her son unconditionally, she had spent the last 30 years establishing her own daily rhythms and boundaries. They sat across from each other for 2 hours, hammering out the terms of a new cohabitation contract that covered every imaginable friction point of daily life. First came the financial division, where they agreed that David would pay exactly $800 a month to cover his share of the increased electricity bill, the high-speed internet upgrade, and the local homeowner association fees. Then came the domestic responsibilities, with Sarah explicitly stating that she was not running a bed and breakfast or a free laundry service for a middle-aged corporate manager. David was assigned specific days for mowing the half-acre lawn, taking out the heavy trash bins to the curb on Tuesday nights, and deep cleaning the shared bathroom every weekend. But the most difficult part of the negotiation was the invasion of privacy and the boundaries of independent adulthood. Sarah looked her son dead in the eye and explained that she still went to bed at 10 o'clock sharp every single night, and the loud clicking of the front deadbolt after midnight would not be tolerated. Furthermore, the kitchen refrigerator was strictly divided with masking tape, separating David's expensive organic groceries from Sarah's traditional frozen dinners and baking supplies. Even the living room television schedule had to be codified, ensuring that David's late-night cable news broadcasts would never conflict with Sarah's beloved evening game shows. It was a profoundly surreal and humbling conversation for a man who had spent the last 15 years managing large corporate budgets and leading teams of dozens of employees. David found himself agreeing to a chore wheel and a kitchen schedule just to secure a place to sleep. Yet, as he signed his name at the bottom of that legal pad, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. This formal agreement stripped away the lingering illusion that he was just a child visiting his mother for the holidays. It forced both of them to view each other as equal, consenting adults who were forming a strategic economic alliance to survive the harsh financial realities of 2026. The old hierarchy of parent and child had to be completely demolished to make room for a practical business partnership, setting the stage for a bizarre new daily routine where a 54-year-old man had to navigate the exact same halls he used to run through in his youth, but this time with a pocket full of rent money and a strict curfew. Once the initial shock of the moving truck wore off, David Carter plunged headfirst into the deeply strange and often exhausting reality of sharing a house with his mother after 30 years of complete independence. The first month on Oak Street felt like a psychological collision between two completely different eras of American history. Every single morning, David's corporate life as a high-powered logistics manager clashed violently with the quiet retirement routine of a 79-year-old grandmother. David would wake up at 6 o'clock to join international conference calls on his laptop, trying desperately to sound authoritative and professional while pacing the narrow hallway outside his childhood bedroom. He would be in the middle of discussing multi-million-dollar supply chain budgets with executives in New York, only for the loud, grinding roar of Sarah's 1980s blender to erupt from the kitchen as she prepared her morning green smoothie. The physical limitations of the house became an everyday battleground as well, because the home was originally built in 1974 and only possessed 1.5 bathrooms. This meant that David, a 54-year-old man who used to have his own private master suite, now had to coordinate his morning routine around his mother's daily schedule. If he had an urgent 8 a.m. presentation, he had to make sure he was out of the shower before Sarah began her morning skincare regimen. Otherwise, he would be left standing in the hallway in his bathrobe, staring at the clock in pure panic. The kitchen was another source of silent friction because Sarah's decades-old cooking habits did not align with David's modern lifestyle. David would come home from a stressful 10-hour workday, wanting nothing more than to grill a quick steak and steam some vegetables, only to find the entire stove occupied by Sarah's massive pots of homemade chicken soup that had been simmering since noon. Even the simple act of checking the mail became a delicate dance of territory, because Sarah was used to collecting the letters exactly at 2 o'clock every single afternoon. And when David's corporate packages and business documents began piling up on the small entryway table, she complained that his life was completely swallowing up her living space. But the absolute peak of discomfort occurred during David's attempts to maintain a social life. One Friday evening, David invited a female colleague from his office out for a casual dinner, but the sheer awkwardness of having to tell a 50-year-old woman that he needed to be home by 10 p.m. because his mother did not like the front door unlocking late at night was completely mortifying. He felt like a high school teenager all over again, hiding in his room to make private phone calls and speaking in a hushed whisper so his mother wouldn't overhear his conversations through the thin drywall. Every single corner of the house held a memory from his past, making him feel as though his entire adult identity was being slowly erased by the ghosts of his youth. Yet, despite the daily embarrassments and the constant negotiations over refrigerator shelves, something subtle was beginning to shift beneath the surface of their tension as they both adjusted to this bizarre new life. The delicate and often stressful boundary lines of their new living arrangement were completely shattered on a rainy Tuesday morning in late October. David Carter was in the middle of a high-stakes corporate conference call in his bedroom, his eyes fixed on his laptop screen as he discussed a massive shipping delay on the West Coast. Suddenly, a strange, hollow thud echoed from the hallway, followed by a sharp gasp that did not sound right. David immediately muted his microphone, threw his headset onto the bed, and rushed out of the room to investigate the noise. He found his 79-year-old mother, Sarah, collapsed on the hardwood floor near the linen closet, her face incredibly pale and her hand clutching her chest in obvious agony. In that terrifying second, the corporate manager disappeared and the frantic son took over as David dropped to his knees, checking her pulse and dialing 911 on his cell phone with trembling fingers. Within less than 10 minutes, the quiet suburban street was filled with the flashing red lights and loud sirens of an emergency medical truck. As the paramedics loaded Sarah onto a stretcher and wheeled her out the front door, David stood in the driveway under the pouring rain, feeling completely helpless for the first time in his adult life. He followed the ambulance to the local hospital, spending 6 agonizing hours in a sterile waiting room, drinking terrible machine coffee and staring at the floor. When the cardiologist finally emerged from the double doors, the news was sobering but manageable as he explained that Sarah had suffered a minor cardiac event brought on by an undetected heart blockage. The doctor looked directly at David and said that his mother was going to make a full recovery, but she could absolutely no longer live alone because she would require daily monitoring, medication management, and help with her physical therapy for the next several months. Sitting by his mother's hospital bed later that evening, watching her sleep under the dim fluorescent lights, a massive realization washed over David like a tidal wave. For the past 6 months, his entire mindset had been poisoned by resentment, viewing this house as a symbol of his personal failure and financial defeat. But as he looked at her fragile frame, he realized that his economic misfortune had actually been a bizarre form of cosmic timing. If he had still been living across town in his expensive luxury apartment, consumed by his own busy schedule, Sarah would have been completely alone in that house when her heart failed. She might have lain on that floor for days before anyone noticed, a thought that made David's stomach turn into knots. His financial retreat had inadvertently placed him exactly where he needed to be to save his mother's life. The old narrative he had built in his head completely dissolved, transforming his shame into a profound sense of duty. He wasn't a 54-year-old failure blaming off his parent. He was a strategic guardian who had been positioned perfectly to protect the woman who had given him everything. The question of who was saving whom had been answered in the most dramatic way possible, turning their forced roommate agreement into a vital, life-saving partnership that would redefine their future on Oak Street forever. Following Sarah's release from the hospital, the dynamic on Oak Street underwent a massive spatial and architectural evolution that reflected a growing trend across suburban America. David Carter realized that if they were going to survive long-term under one roof while maintaining their individual sanity, the 1974 house needed a radical transformation. He pooled his remaining savings, which had been growing rapidly at $4,000 a month since he stopped paying apartment rent, and decided to fund a complete downsizing revolution right there on the property. He hired a local contractor to convert the detached two-car garage into a modern, fully independent living space known in America as an accessory dwelling unit, or simply an ADU. This 600-square-foot secondary suite was engineered specifically for Sarah's new mobility needs, featuring a zero-threshold walk-in shower, wide doorways for easy navigation, and a beautiful, compact kitchen with lowered countertops. By moving his mother into this bright, accessible new space, David was able to take over the main house, while keeping Sarah just 30 feet away across the small backyard lawn. This construction project wasn't just happening on Oak Street, as David discovered through his private online forum that thousands of middle-aged boomerangers were doing the exact same thing to properties across the United States. Cities and towns that had spent decades enforcing strict single-family zoning laws were suddenly erasing those old regulations to allow for these multi-generational additions because the cost of assisted living facilities had skyrocketed to over $8,000 a month in 26. Middle-class families were looking at the brutal financial math and realizing that instead of burning their wealth on corporate nursing homes or expensive downtown apartment leases, it made infinitely more sense to invest that capital directly into their own family real estate. The entire neighborhood was changing as construction trucks lined the streets, with families adding secondary suites, converting basements, and building separate entrance ramps for aging parents and returning children. This physical restructuring of suburban real estate was the visible manifestation of a profound cultural shift where the old American ideal of the isolated nuclear family was being permanently replaced by a more practical, interconnected model of survival. For David and Sarah, watching the drywall go up and the new plumbing being installed became a source of shared excitement rather than stress. They were no longer trying to force two separate lives into a single cramped hallway, but were instead designing a custom-built solution that honored both Sarah's fierce desire for independence and David's need to act as her primary protector. By breaking down the physical walls of the old house, they had accidentally built a blueprint for a new way of living that was currently sweeping across the nation, turning a private financial crisis into a beautiful master class in generational solidarity. With the new living spaces completed and the immediate medical emergency behind them, David Carter found himself confronting the deepest and most painful layer of his entire journey, which was the total surrender of his middle-aged pride. For nearly 30 years, David had measured his worth as an American man by the size of his salary, the zip code of his residence, and his complete independence from his family of origin. When he first arrived on Oak Street with his moving truck, he felt like a total ghost of a man, an imposter who had to hide his living situation from his corporate colleagues and delete his location data on social media apps, because he was terrified of being judged. He would make up elaborate excuses during office small talk about why he was suddenly so familiar with the suburban diners and grocery stores on the south side of town, always steering the conversation away from his domestic reality. But as the months rolled by in 2026, David began to realize that the heavy armor of his professional ego had actually been keeping him profoundly isolated from the things that mattered most. Sitting on the back porch on a cool spring evening, watching the warm lights glow from his mother's new accessory dwelling unit across the small lawn, he experienced a strange and unexpected sense of deep emotional healing. He realized that the expensive downtown apartment he had fought so hard to keep had been nothing more than a lonely, overpriced holding cell that kept him disconnected from his roots. The forced breakdown of his independent lifestyle had stripped away his superficial vanity, leaving behind a much stronger, more resilient version of himself. He no longer cared about the unwritten societal rules that dictated a 54-year-old man must live in total isolation to be considered successful. He stopped checking the private online forum for tips on how to hide his suitcase from the neighbors, and instead began posting his own advice to help other middle-aged men who were still drowning in their own silent shame. He told them that letting go of a broken American dream wasn't a sign of weakness, but an act of supreme courage and radical common sense. He discovered that true maturity wasn't about building a wall around your life, but about having the humility to return to the people who loved you when the world became too heavy to carry alone. The superficial embarrassment that had choked him for months completely evaporated, replaced by a quiet, unshakable peace that he had never found in any high-rise luxury condo or corporate promotion. David had finally paid the heavy price of his pride, and in return, he had gained something that money could never buy: a deep sense of absolute purpose and a realigned life that was no longer anchored by what society expected of him, but by what his family actually needed to survive. As 2026 draws to a close, the story of David and Sarah Carter is no longer just a unique tale of family survival, but a complete blueprint for the future of the American middle class. Look around the suburban streets of your own town, and you will see the physical evidence of this massive transformation happening right before your eyes. The old American expectation that every single adult must maintain an isolated, highly expensive piece of real estate just to prove their worth to society is officially dead. It has been replaced by a new, highly practical model of intergenerational living that pools family wealth, shares escalating daily expenses, and provides vital care for aging parents. David Carter managed to completely reverse his financial trajectory by saving nearly $50,000 in a single year, money that went directly into a retirement fund and a beautiful property upgrade rather than a corporate landlord's bank account. But more importantly, he and his mother built a deep, unshakable bond that would have been completely impossible if they had remained isolated in their separate worlds. The 50-plus boomerang generation is completely rewriting the rules of what it means to be successful, independent, and resilient in a rapidly changing economy. They are proving that returning to your roots is not a step backward, but rather a brilliant, tactical leap forward that protects both the financial future of the children and the physical health of the parents. This silent movement is dismantling decades of cultural stigma, forcing local governments to change outdated housing laws, and inspiring millions of families to reevaluate what truly matters. The traditional American dream may have evolved into an unsustainable illusion, but the new reality being built on streets like Oak Street is something infinitely better: a deeply connected, economically secure, and emotionally grounded way of moving forward together. When the economic history of this era is finally written, it will show that the salvation of the middle class did not come from corporate raises or government programs, but from the quiet courage of millions of individuals who were brave enough to pack their bags, swallow their pride, and walk right back through the front doors of their childhood homes.